we talk about the NWA, which a lot of people just see as this wrestling organization, but it was kind of the, the standard bearer of that alliance that all of these territories had at one time. And they all worked together. It was, and I often describe it as kind of like a mafia territory, the way they divided it up without, the whacking guys and doing that kind of thing. But it was kind of the same way that organization was put together, right? I mean, tell me a little bit about how that all worked back then from what you remember.
The NWA was definitely the powerhouse, and I'm going to use Minneapolis as an example. Minneapolis was part of the NWA territory. And, I'm a wrestling collector, and, part of the stuff that I have in my collection, I'll see these letters that went from Fred Kohler or whoever that was an NWA powerhouse back in the day, Sam Muchnick, on and on and on. And, you described it, Sean, as a little bit of a mafia situation. Obviously, that would be, a little bit over the top. But in the sense that the NWA really was a powerhouse. They were a governing body. They had tremendous power, tremendous say-so. And the cities and towns and areas that were under their jurisdiction really had to fall into line. If they didn't, they fell out of favor with the NWA. So it was really interesting because Verne and the AWA were really the first group that had the guts and the balls, I guess, to splinter off and say, okay, you know what? That's enough. We're going to do our own thing here. We think we have enough of a fan base. We don't need to be under your jurisdiction anymore. And that sort of opened up the floodgates, because then you had the old, WWF and, all the groups that followed, WWA with Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder. But I think in the sense that, if you look at history, Verne and the AWA and Wally Carbo were the first group to really cut the ties, if you will, with the NWA. Very interesting. But to your point, the NWA was a tremendous powerhouse, and they had a stranglehold on the wrestling business for, many, many years.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't understand that, because they look at what Vince McMahon did and they went like, oh my God, he just took over all these territories and didn't care what anybody else thought. But, before that, in many ways, it was already controlled like that across the country, because people respected their territories, as they called them, and they would exchange talent. Nobody crossed over into other and did shows in their territory. And then you did have people that there were promoters out there said, I don't want to be part of this. And they tried to do different things. Most of the time they were shut down. But Gagne, as you mentioned, was one of those who was able to really pull it off initially. And it wasn't as though they just stayed in Minnesota. I mean, they had eventually, shows all over the country. And I think that that's something else that people don't realize either, that, they were in Milwaukee, they were in Chicago, they were in these cities, even out west in Denver and in California and San Francisco. So it wasn't like Vince was this incredible visionary. It was not that these guys didn't have the same ideas. He just pulled it off in a major way years later.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And, you mentioned the AWA's influence and the power that they had. And it's interesting, because the modern day wrestling fan, if you really don't, go back in time as a wrestling historian or a longtime fan, you don't realize just how good and the expanse that the AWA had. You made a very good point. Some of the cities that you mentioned, and of course, they went into Japan when Bockwinkel and Stevens were the AWA Tag Team Champions. They went to Florida, Winnipeg, and then, of course, Leo Nomlini, that I mentioned before, was promoting for them out in San Francisco. North and South Dakota, Milwaukee, Green Bay, Chicago. And this was like consistent. Every single month, all the AWA major cities were running, and they would run the circuit, and there was a time when everybody was selling out. They'd draw 12,000, 13,000 people in Milwaukee, and the next night they're in Minneapolis, they're drawing another 10 to 15,000 people, and the same in Chicago. So the AWA, I would say from probably, middle 1960s, at least until the early 1980s, was an amazingly successful promotion.
Yeah. And they all had television, and folks don't think that they weren't thinking the same thing when these superstations came along and cable They wanted to do the same thing. It's just that Vince was ahead of the game on that, had been taking syndicated programming and literally buying airtime across the country. But they all had these ideas. It's just that Vince is the one who ended up on top of it all. But I think in some reason I like to bring that up is because a lot of people think that it was just Vince, that Vince had this idea. And they all were like, whoa, how can he do this? Well, they had the same idea. He just pulled it off.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Everybody had the vision, but nobody did anything about it. And then, whether you love the guy or hate the guy or whatever, Vince really rolled the dice, with the first WrestleMania and what have you. And then all of a sudden, all these other promoters, suddenly it became an abhorrent thing to do, to take over all the territories. When you're right, Sean, they all thought about it, but nobody ever pulled the trigger.